Marine Biology by Reed Works. Frank had surfed for as long as he could remember. A tall and thin but athletic guy, he grew up in the sleepy beach town of Montauk, New York, at the very tip of Long Island. His parents, who had owned a popular seafood restaurant on Main Street, had first put him on a board at the age of 3 or 4. Some of his first memories involve sliding down a wave in the sun, seated at the front of his dad's longboard. During the winter, Montauk had great waves. In fact, they were considered some of the best on the east coast of the United States. But the water was so cold, a wetsuit was required. And while the waves in the summer weren't too bad either, they were nothing compared to the waves in Southern California. As a boy, Frank and his friends subscribed to all the big surf magazines. They dreamed of surfing big waves on the North Shore of Oahu, Hawaii, or at Tihupo on the island of Tahiti. Their pal Clay, who moved from Montauk to Santa Barbara, California in middle school, filled their heads with stories of surfing in his hometown. Sometimes the waves got as high as 20 feet, he'd say, causing Frank and his surfing buddies to gasp. Clay, of course, had never actually surfed a 20-foot wave, but he had sat and watched as professional surfers paddled out, caught them, and rowed them all the way to the shore. At only 13, Frank saved up enough for his weekly allowance to buy a plane ticket to Los Angeles. His uncle, Jim, lived near Malibu, a small beach town north of LA. He drove Frank out to a famous surf break near his bungalow in the hills. Used to the small, easy waves of Montauk, Frank was intimidated by the booming surf. Standing on the beach, he could feel the pounding of the waves vibrating under his feet. He paddled out anyway. After a struggle, he finally made it into the lineup. The other surfers in the water stared at him warily. They could tell he wasn't from California. His pale skin gave him away. But when Frank started paddling into a wave, they moved out of the way for him. "Let's see what the kid can do," one of them said. They all watched as Frank stood up. Almost as quickly, he was back in the water. The waves crashed over him and sent Frank tumbling through the wake. Frank wasn't discouraged. In fact, he was filled with optimism. As he gasped for air after the wipeout, he resolved to attend college in California. That way, whenever he wasn't studying, he could drive out to the beach and surf waves like this. Eventually, he thought he'd be able to handle them like Kelly Slater, the 11-time world surfing champion. Like anything, he thought, all it takes is practice. So when it came time to apply to college, Frank looked only at schools bordering the ocean on the West Coast. His parents, who didn't like the idea of their son moving so far away, tried to convince him to stay closer to home. Parts of Southern New Jersey have great waves, his dad said over pasta one night. And don't forget the swells at Rockaway Beach, his mom added. Ever since Hurricane Sandy, they've been getting bigger and bigger. If you went to New York University, Rockaway Beach is only 30 minutes away. But Frank had already made up his mind. He applied to the University of California at Santa Cruz, the University of California at Santa Barbara, and Pepperdine University, which was located just a short drive from his Uncle Jim's in Malibu. His grades and SAT scores were good enough that he was admitted to all three. He resorted to drawing stars. "Pepperdine it is," he shouted as his mom and dad looked on from the couch. As much as they didn't want him to be so far from home, they understood his dedication to surfing. "Just remember, studying before surfing," his mom warned him. "Not everyone becomes a rich and professional surfer. You have to think about an actual career. After all, if you want to live near the beach when you're older, you're going to have to earn some money." "I know, Mom," Frank said, giving her a hug. He promised to surf only once he'd finished his homework. This proved harder than he had imagined. After growing up in the choppy, waist-high surf of Long Island, the curling blue barrels of Southern California were a big distraction from the hard, lonely work of studying Chemistry 101 and the history of the Civil War. His first month at Pepperdine, he spent every morning surfing at world-famous beaches like Leo Carrillo and El Matador. Pretty soon, he was spending every late afternoon surfing there too. Due to the amount of time he spent at the ocean, he quickly befriended the local surfers from the area. A social, handsome guy, as well as a talented surfer, Frank became popular in Malibu's surfing community. While his college roommate made friends with other students, Frank found himself hanging out with people from the town instead. Needless to say, his obsession with surfing didn't help his grades. When the waves were good, Frank would skip class to go out and ride them. The better he got, the more he wanted to be out there. "This was all I ever wanted out of life," he told his new friends one night as they roasted marshmallows around a bonfire at the beach. They smiled and nodded. They knew exactly what he meant. Several of them had dropped out of college to become what they had called full-time surfers. Then one day he got a call from his advisor, a professor of marine biology, whose class Frank had skipped on many occasions. "Looking at your attendance record here, Frank, and it's not pretty," Professor Blank Fine began. "Over the last month, you've missed more than half of your scheduled classes. From my conversations with your professors, you're in danger of failing 3 out of 4 of your classes. Is there a problem I should know about?" Frank was silent on the other line. He didn't know what to say. He was fully aware that he hadn't been showing up to class, but the fact that he might flunk out of college in his first semester sent a chill through his body, reminded him of the feeling of jumping into sea in Montauk in mid-February. Having finally tasted the waves of Malibu, he certainly didn't want to return to those meager freezing waves. "I'm sorry, Professor Blankfein," Frank said at last. "I don't know what's come over me. It's just the waves out here. I think I've become obsessed with them." Frank heard his marine biology professor laugh on the other line. "I sympathize," he said. "I grew up surfing in New Jersey. Why do you think I work at Pepperdine in the field of marine biology? I created a career that allows me to be in the water as much as I want. If you're serious about the ocean, you should start thinking about a career in marine biology." Frank thanked his professor and hung up the phone. The thick marine biology textbook on his desk suddenly seemed full of possibility.